Well, welcome this evening to the first of a series of conversations that we'll be hosting as part of Architecture at the Edge, a festival that allows the public an opportunity to discover the built environment from unexpected perspectives and to strengthen the sense of place and community within the west of Ireland. I'm Niall Maxwell from Royal Office for Architecture, and I'll be hosting these conversations as part of a dialogue with Ireland from our base in Wales. Let me just get over my technical issues. This year's festival is called Boundaries. Boundaries is really an opportunity to bring together professionals and academics to learn, create, exchange, and apply knowledge to issues relevant to our communities. We're obviously surrounded by boundaries. And there's a rather lovely text that goes with the festival, which describes that living in the west of Ireland is to be surrounded by boundaries, structures, infrastructures, the coastline, field boundaries. Look around the west of Ireland and everywhere you will see the architectural memories and morphology that define us, past and present, and our place in society. We live and work within frameworks, systems and environments, physical, social, cultural, that enmeshes. And this is really interesting because it's a starting point. And when we were asked to host these conversations, our first boundary was the fact that, of course, we're all virtual at the moment. We don't have the ability to be in Galway tonight. We don't have the ability to collect together a range of voices to start a conversation. And that conversation is about a future summer school in Galway in 2021. It's a city that's familiar with the festival, having hosted it for the last 3 years, and it's used to structures and conversations happening with partners across Europe about the architectural dialogue, with academics, with other professionals, and with the community. And it's the community that's important, I think, in this instance, because we need to frame in these conversations, what is it that we are trying to achieve with a summer school? Who is it actually going to serve? And who is included in the process of design? And I think as architects, we do have perhaps a problem with identifying with a broader section of society, or actually not getting out of our silo and understand that others can contribute to the process. So part of this conversation tonight is about participatory design and understanding the methods and means by which we could broaden that conversation. So the summer school becomes about the community of Galway and not just about the architectural community. So if you look at the mission statement for the festival, it sets out sort of 5 clear strategic goals. One is to create platforms to empower and learn in society. The second, to make architecture more accessible. The third, to promote design, best practice and sustainable development. The fourth, to improve the perception of architecture and that of the architect locally and internationally. And of course, finally, to help shape the quality of our built environment. So our interest tonight is to really look at what's going on around Europe. And predominantly for this conversation, we've focused on Ireland, Wales and England, and voices that provide very different forms of participatory design practice, from working with young children all the way through to different forms of social practice. The first of our guests tonight is Tom Keeley. Tom runs an estate agent that doesn't sell you a travel. And what we like about Tom's work is his practice works between architectures, geographies, landscapes, and histories through practice-based research, designing projects and specific site-specific writing, with a twofold interest in both the research of a given territory and the territory of the research itself. His recent research is in the Borders country, a form of boundary in itself between the north and south of Ireland, which will include next year the restaging of a Hedge school to celebrate the centenary of partition. We're also joined by Fee from Matt and Fiona, the Successful Geo, an award-winning organisation that enables young children to set the brief for a space or a place, design it, and then bring it to reality by building it. Their completed projects include a permanent outdoor classroom on an allotment in Hull, a playground shelter at a school for children with autism, and a family makerspace completed within the Institute of Imagination. The most interesting thing about Fee, of course, is that her day job is Head of Learning at the Design Museum. And then finally, we're joined by actually a friend of mine and a collaborator, Owen Griffiths from Wales. He's an artist, workshop leader, facilitator, specialising in social practice, using participatory and collaborative processes to explore the possibilities of art, to create new frameworks, resources, and systems. This takes many forms, but includes reclaiming and rethinking events, rituals, and spaces of dialogue through making gardens, co-designing spaces, curating events and making feasts. Owen explores climate, landscape, urbanism, social justice, food systems, and pedagogy. It's a really broad range, and I'm pretty grateful that hopefully these three voices can help to sow the seed for what will become the Summer School of Galway 2021. Welcome to you all, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and blathering on. Tom, where do we find you tonight? Because you were at the Bartlett for a long time, and now suddenly you're in Ireland.
Yeah,
I'm still.
Well, I've been at the Bartlett the last kind of 2 or 3 years doing my PhD, which began before the UK EU referendum and was initially this kind of quite romantic walk along the border based on Colm Tóibín's book of the late 80s, and it's since become a lot more complicated. But for the last year of the research, I decided to come and base myself in Cork and use that as a jumping off point for going up to the border and actually beginning to kind of do more site specific, more embedded work in there, including the Hedge School, which will be next May.
Okay, so you're practicing what you preach by embedding yourself in order to understand the process of design. Owen, where do we find you tonight? You're looking very bookish, which is unusual for you. You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm in Swansea in the studio in South Wales, and yeah, I've just been thinking a lot in the preparation of this around localism, long-term work, and all of those things, especially kind of more meaningful during COVID, where we can't actually go anywhere. So we're actually in a lockdown at the moment here.
Yeah, you're part of the unwashed southern belt of Wales, aren't you? Where everybody's in lockdown. We're the only part just slightly further north that isn't. Fee, you're in London, not in lockdown. Whereabouts are you at the moment? You're in the studio?
I am in the studio because it's Friday. So I'm actually on the side of Waterloo Station in a porter cabin, which is our studio. So I'm not in the Design Museum today.
Okay, so do you split your time? Is it 4 days at the Design Museum, 1 day at Matt Fiona? How does the work balance work on that front? That's
technically how it works, and definitely physically how it works, that those days I'm in the museum, and we're open again, which is great. So I'm normally in the museum at least 2 or 3 days a week.
Okay, and how much of the time at the museum is spent with outreach, and how much is desk time? Are you often involved with school groups and processes that are going on within the museum itself, or is it mainly planning education programs?
Obviously, in current times, there's a lot of planning, lots of re-strategizing, but we've been doing a few face-to-face workshops throughout the summer, and our learning program is broad. It goes from early years all the way to a master's in curating. So our master's students actually came back on site a couple of weeks ago, which is great. So we're trying to do as much face-to-face as we can. In reality, it will probably stay in this strange blended world for a little while.
Yeah, goodness knows how long. Tom, we talked before we came on air about everybody maybe just sharing a few images to help those who are watching with us and listening in as to your own practice, and maybe to embellish on what they may have looked at online. Could you share your screen just to sort of talk us through that?
Yeah. Okay.
It takes a few seconds to kind of get us all loaded up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I limited you all to 3 images, really, or tried to, at least, just to sort of give a flavour, really, for the way you think.
So my background was kind of in writing about places. I started off doing fanzines when I left university after studying landscape architecture, and kind of fell into kind of, I guess, other forms of education that might have been outside the academy. And the point where I really began to test this was when I opened a university, which hopefully you can see on your screen, in Kilburn, which is an area of northwest London. And the idea was that it was kind of a slow, messy, itinerant institution that used this kind of quite well, a very everyday kind of high road as it's both its classroom and its curriculum. Here you can see there was a kit of parts that here was installed in the upstairs of a pub where Doreen Massey gave a lecture, God bless her, on neoliberalism and the high road. This kind of came out of a frustration with working quickly in a funny kind of way, and a kind of this kind of drawn out, more embedded way of working that actually would aim to leave something behind rather than kind of fleetingly move on to the next site. And I guess that's really what where part of my work on the border came out through my PhD. Here, I walked the length of the border from Derry to Carlingford over a month in what would have been up to Brexit Day, the original Brexit Day last March in 2019. And here there is a picture of a house in Leitrim, in Glenfarne. I called it somewhere the Leitrimnian Sublime. And I basically began to gather all these images of different kinds of buildings as hedges in this case, or types of material the border was made up of, and begin to form different kind of arrangements of these kind of materials, sites, places, histories, in the way that kind of that abut and they kind of grind across each other and can contradict in the same way that the contested nature of the border's history does the very same thing. But with the Hedge School, this kind of, if it loads, is this kind of drawn out way of working in a place, of getting under the skin of a place. It's not a one-way transaction where I go there and absorb it and go and do something nice or make something kind of somewhere far away. I think it's about the kind of, I guess, messy reality of places where there's an exchange in other ways. And while, particularly with academia, there's kind of like, you could say there's the official history is one that often gets the limelight. I think I'm more or equally interested in the unofficial histories, and the ones where hopefully at this Hedge School, which is due to take place on the centenary of partition next year in Derry, there will be a different kind of knowledge that's kind of given, put on a pedestal, and a new body of work, a new piece of work will come out from the participants, invited and local, who will take part in it.
Could you just briefly tell us about the history of the Hedge School? Because for some people it may not be part of their history.
Yeah, I mean, Hedge Schools are very particularly Irish educational precedent, which came about when Catholics were banned from formal education in the penal laws of the 17th and 18th and 20th century. And they were kind of very much rooted in the landscape. They would take place not strictly in hedges, but in kind of barns, in back rooms. In fact, Brian Friel's play, which is where I kind of began to get interested in it, Translations, was set in a hedge school, and that was kind of set around when the British Ordnance Survey mapped Ireland and began to translate away from the kind of structure of places in the Irish language, and kind of phonetically shifting them into a language of an outside force. And that kind of space for where those conversations could happen is what kind of got me kind of started in thinking about it. Well, I'm not kind of recreating a traditional hedge school. It's kind of a model that's rooted in a place, hopefully, that has some of the same spirit.
So it's an interesting situation, isn't it, where you're embedding yourself, but also you're sort of almost reading a different type of anecdotal history, which is part you, I suppose, as detective, but also part gathering from social sources rather than just academic sources. Would that be fair? Yeah,
that would definitely be fair. And I think it's where they begin to blur is where it gets really kind of, for me, kind of crunchy and interesting. There is in kind of the research I've been doing to set it all up, I've read a bit of this woman called Svetlana Alexievich, who was the Nobel laureate, I can't remember which year, some years ago, in the last 10 years maybe. And she wrote a book called Secondhand Time, which is an amazing book, which is basically consists of all these oral testimonies, these histories of the breakup of the Soviet Union from the late 80s up until maybe early noughties. And I think it's this kind of this polyphonic, almost kind of choral reading of a place and a history and a time that where not one voice outweighs the other is kind of a mode that I'm kind of really interested in working with. So while I'm not doing an oral history, I think some of the means of other types of oral history and kind of situated knowledges is definitely something that comes into it.
Fascinating. Could I ask you to stop sharing the screen? Because that would allow Owen maybe to come in, because it sort of segues quite nicely, actually. You've got a kind of localism agenda going on, I suppose, even though you're working dotted around the UK on different projects from Manchester up to sort of Barron-Furness. Actually, you are quite rooted in the south, in the southern valleys. Could you maybe expand on that?
Yeah, as I was saying, you know, like I've been thinking a lot about the phrase "digging where you stand" recently, and obviously, lockdown and the restrictions we've all been going through, the idea of working hyper locally has become really, really important. So, ideas of like long-term relationships, localism, how to feed it into local infrastructure, how to kind of really understand through practice has become a really important part of the last kind of couple of years of working in South Wales. And that return to South Wales, we you know, before that I was in Copenhagen for a few years and was part of a school, the School of War space at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen, which was like a radical pedagogic zone where we as the students kind of developed a curriculum and managed the budget and worked with an artist called Niels Norman to do that. So, you know, coming from that back to Swansea, my hometown, having kids and being here, just thinking, how do I work with this radical education? And I think the most useful way of doing that was to kind of embed it locally and to really have a dialogue with the place. Which I think is really, really interesting and also quite challenging and quite exhausting work as well. So it's not necessarily easy. So the idea of long-term relationships and what we can gain is really of interest to me, and how we create collaborative relationships based on agendas of anti-gentrification, which questions agendas of heritage, tourism, regeneration, which often leave the communities that I work with behind. And this local work makes me think, and what Tom was just saying, about the edges. So where these edges and agendas meet, you know. So in permaculture, they talk about the edge as the most biodiverse and most creative space. So when the forest meets the meadow, or where one system of agriculture meets a hedge, for example, these are the spaces of greatest creativity and greatest exchange. And cities are full of edges, like he said, Galway, and so I think there's something really interesting here about practicing in the edge, and it feels like very much working in South Wales that you are on the edge of something and a bit disconnected from London, a bit disconnected from Cardiff sometimes. And so I think there's a real power in that space, and you've got to kind of dig in and dig deep to work with it. So that's really important part of the practice. And for me, you know, the last couple of years, the projects have been, you know, varied from working with school children, transforming a derelict school into a kind of a community arts centre, looking at pottery, looking at ways of where we make the infrastructure of a school and what we might need with a multi-generational group of people, to kind of projects where we're rereading our post-industrial landscape in South Wales and really rethinking the connections and the true narratives of these landscapes. So what are the connections to colonialism, to extraction, to austerity, to neoliberalism, and how do we talk about that in community centres and in spaces? And how do we reconnect with ideas of like how the miners built through subscription radical spaces for community education, where, you know, Marxist literature and all these great ideas were discussed in these spaces, but actually we've really lost the connection to that radical history in Wales. So I'm really keen to explore where that dormancy is in our communities and how we can activate that. So conversations around climate empowerment, you know, how we get people involved in project, how we kind of avoid using people as material and avoid marginalizing or kind of repeating structures of you know, cultural power systems. Or how do we kind of avoid those models which are really easy to adopt or really easy to fall back into? So there's a real conscious effort in a lot of the practice and a lot of dialogues with the commissioners around how we kind of play for time, how we need longer time to work with these communities, how we can't kind of just do a tick box kind of consultation or dialogue. It's actually much harder and much the need to have these longer term dialogues are really, really important. So I guess I wanted to share just a couple of images to show some of these projects and the kind of breadth of them, whether it's feasts, as you said, Niall, to making dens with kids, to exploring Augusto Boal theatre games in the Rhondda Valley, to redesign a park. It's the process that's more interesting a lot of the time than the end result. But I guess what's really important to all of these projects and the way that I work is this long-term dialogue with places, so that also we're leaving something sustainable, not just parachuting in to develop a project, but also that we're creating something which is of use and is connected to local infrastructure, local culture. And these kind of conversations are around how we redesign a street at the moment, working with one particular street in Swansea. Again, this would be the fifth or fourth project in the square mile of the studio, where we're working on the train station to redesign a derelict piece of land. We're working with the Glenvivian Gallery to work with community groups to redesign a garden, and we're also working with this one street to think about how could a community kind of raise up, and how could we challenge these agendas of these kind of off-the-shelf kind of urban design packages, which are in local authorities, which are good to go and just need funding drawn down from. So how can we engage in really radical ways of thinking? And I was just thinking about, when I was looking at Matt and Fiona's work and Tom's work, about Mini München, the amazing festival in Munich. I don't know if you know it, but it's an incredible, radical, utopian, pedagogical experiment where thousands of kids gather and design a city. And they design the complete infrastructure for this. So they have restaurants, they have theatres, they have a bank, they have a financial system, a stock market, and transport, public transport systems, and a university. And these ideas of how we engage people and communities in the challenges of the future, whether it's climate or whether it's COVID or kind of racial injustice, this is like an urgency around this community work, which I've never felt before. And I feel like this is a really strong thing to bring to a really local context. And I think one of the key things we've been talking about recently is how is this practice speaking to the idea of becoming a good ancestor and working with future generations?
Fascinating stuff, Owen. While you stop sharing your screen so Fee can share hers, I just want to pick up on one thing that you said about people as material. What do you mean by that? Because it could be taken in two different ways.
I guess it's always the case where, as an artist, I'm asked to go and work with a group that people forgot to ask or forgot to consult with. So you kind of feel like they're using those people as material. They're using them to kind of get to the point where they've got a pre-drawn conclusion and they're just fulfilling something, whereas or using people's labor or using people's energy to get to projects. And actually these things aren't radically rooted, they're not long-term, they're not actually empowering for people. And I think a lot of the time what we need to think about is potentially how is this a collaborative kind of venture? Are we talking about the idea of sharing labor? If we think of the word collaboration, it's co-labor. How do we think about that, the work involved in these projects? How can we pay communities to be involved in projects if we really value this input? And how do we look at different models around this rather than just cherry picking what we want to hear from these communities and just using that? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
That's helpful to clarify, because I suppose I was thinking that I knew you were going to say that in that sense, that it was almost a negative or pejorative position. But I suppose for you, Fee, you've got young people as material in a very positive sort of way of engaging. Can you maybe expand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that point that Owen makes is so important. I'd say arguably even more so with young people, that they can both be used and feel used in terms of creating the narrative to see a project through. And that's something that very much at the heart of everything that Matt and I do, is we want to be genuine to those young people in both managing their expectations, but also ensuring that what it is that they are imagining, that is what comes to life, not something that's sort of value engineered or downgraded from their aspirations. And you could arguably take out in this slide the words young people, just how many people look around them and feel that they have a say in what they see. And we're driven by trying to, very, very similarly to Tom and Owen, trying to empower, in this case, children to be able to take ownership of their built environment and to directly shape it. And I think, I mean, Matt and I, we're old friends, and we both had, we've collaborated kind of on an ongoing basis for about 10 years now. We met when I was working at Open City and Matt was volunteering. And it's an amazing organisation that very often asks young people to design. And then we started talking, well, why are we just asking young people to design? Why are we not actually letting them, first of all, set the brief for what it is that they're designing, because they know, they're the experts on their world. They know what it is that they need, or what would be exciting or fun, or would make their lives better. And then at the other end, why are we not enabling them to actually make what it is that they've imagined and bring that into reality? And I suppose the way that we try and work with groups of young people is to we're against the idea of competition. I guess it's similar to what Tom was saying about ideas of being polyphonic, that everyone's ideas are valid and hold value. And so the process, the journey that we kind of go on with young people, we try to find the common themes and tease those out. And we often kind of compare it to going through a series of gateways that start very broad, very wide, and gradually, as we start to see where the compass point is going, they narrow in towards a collective design. So we hope it's not designing by committee, but very much hope that everybody feels empowered and valued in that process. Just to show us an example, we and again, I think there's something interesting about time. So the project I'm showing here is one that we started talking about in 2016 and then working on in 2017 with Lansbury Lawrence Primary School and the Whitechapel Gallery in East London. And this is a school that was built as part of the Festival of Britain, but it hasn't, the number of children in the school has expanded, and physically the school itself hasn't, which has meant that subjects that take more space, like art and design, really kind of struggle to have the facilities they need. And so working with Whitechapel, they have an amazing art teacher who said, why should we as adults be designing this space when the children know the kind of art and creative opportunity and projects they want to do? So why shouldn't they be the ones designing the space? And so we had the privilege to work with Year 6 over a period, in this case it was 3 months, where Matt and I and the team, Jacob, who's pictured here, got to go in once a week and both explore and understand the landscape, the territory of the school through the children's eyes, and then to design with them both at the kind of overall concept level for what this design should be, but also details like the design for the tiles themselves. And so through this kind of process, this is what we sort of called Chapter 1, which resulted in an exhibition, a kind of half scale of one of these oculi that the children had imagined having in their art room that you'd be able to climb into. And Dove was our project lead with this project, and there was this process of bringing the ideas to life, so that it's almost part of the design process, seeing something built at a large scale and then being able to reflect on it and make changes. And this project is still is now going through the next stage of fundraising. We got planning permission, Matt's practice MSA won planning permission last year, and so hopefully this project will now be built in the coming years. So it becomes a legacy project, because these Year 6 students are no longer Year 6 students, they're now at secondary school, they're teenagers, but many of them have got younger siblings at the school. And so again, I think there's something about time with these projects to genuinely be authentic to what the children want takes time. It can't be done overnight. And we're now we're looking to a project in York through a very enlightened designer and community activist called Rebecca Carr, who set up York Design Week. She contacted us, and actually she sent us an email out the blue about 6 months ago saying, it's finally dawned on me what you guys do. I think I finally got it. And ever since then, we've been having these really exciting conversations about how York is about to go through a big period of change with a lot of new housing coming. And housing really hasn't been built on a large scale in York for many, many years. And how do you take the next generation on that journey so that it doesn't feel like it's happening to them, but that in some way they are able to take control. And what's been fantastic is the council have really got behind that, and definitely I think probably similar to maybe to Owen and Tom as well, looking for guerrilla tactics for how to get more bureaucratic kind of buy-in to the projects that you're doing is really important. And probably there's a degree of, we hope that we're absolutely true to what the young people are coming up with, but there's always a degree of performativity sometimes to what's happening behind the scenes in how we work with authorities, I suppose, and legislation.
Okay, that's an interesting point actually, because maybe we could expand that, Tom, in terms of what you're describing, Fee, is a sort of agency, and it's a tacit agency though, because it's working on two different levels, isn't it? One that actually people start noticing what's happening and therefore want to be involved, and then the other, which is people see progress and therefore they start to feel that they can support it or contribute to it, almost like a twofold activity. Tom, did you find that in Kilburn, that actually you got momentum and then suddenly that there was people wanting to contribute, or was it very much that you did all of the sourcing before you went live with it?
I think it was probably a bit of both, and I don't think that work is ever done. It's constantly ongoing. I spent a big chunk of the project actually just kind of being in Kilburn and being present and getting to know people and being visible and actually meeting people. And from that, there became a network that not only connected to the kind of pseudo university, but also to each other. And there began to be like a cohort of sorts that began to coalesce around the university, which kind of ranged from everyone from kind of retired professors to a woman called Dawn, who was a carer who had always lived in Kilburn. She had a very different kind of range of knowledges and experience of the area, that she felt that she could contribute in the same way that the retired professor could, and the space that was created was to allow those exchanges to happen. But I think the frustration maybe, I mean, the Kilburn project lasted for an academic year. And was funded by the two local councils, and I guess building on things that kind of really chimed with what Owen was saying, and Fee. I mean, this whole thing of the fleeting nature of many projects, I found incredibly frustrating, and was one of the reasons why I moved away from some initial ways of working within kind of architectural education in more of a gallery context, but that more drawn out approach, and that kind of question of really what happens when you stay, what happens when there is a relationship that kind of is either in your area in the way that Owen was talking about, or is just a much more long-term kind of engagement with the site.
So you're ending up with this agency giving you both, almost democratizing the public realm, or the people that are engaged. So you're describing an academic on one level and then somebody who's a carer on the other, but both feeling like they have a parity in their ability to contribute to this, which I think is an important point, isn't it? Because it sort of it drives back to being embedded, to actually being human, to being within the community, compared to helicoptering yourself in to deliver. And
I think it's that word as well, delivering. There's a lot of delivering that goes on, particularly within architecture and engagement, and not enough sitting.
Yes. And again, back to the value of time. How do you put a value on just being able to sit and discuss, or anecdotally gather, and all of
and the point of view of how you might think of the work you're doing on a kind of a political level as much as a kind of a work level in terms of labour. Like, is it just a project, or is it kind of an approach, or a worldview, or a way of working that is beyond kind of, you know, a set of funding guidelines, and it's going to happen from this time to this time? Is it what does it build on, and what does it leave, I guess?
Yeah, I suppose it's the same in architecture, really, for small creative practices when they're trying to get on the procurement ladder, and they're looking at this thinking, none of these requirements really meet with the kind of the journey that I expect to go on with a building. I mean, Owen, you see this, I'm sure you're bidding for work as well as a creative, and you must get frustrated by the balance between what you're going to deliver and the requirements that they're expecting as part of this process.
Yeah, for sure, and mostly get so frustrated by the end of organising my own work and just working much more directly a lot of the time as well. So yeah, I was just thinking about this idea of like how, you know, I was just thinking about a project that we had in Trebanog in the Rhondda, and I'll come back to that question now, but like one of the strategies for starting this project, we're talking to the Housing Association about how we start this engagement with the community with an empty building, an empty school, and I just wanted to sweep the school. I thought if we get enough brushes and we all get sweeping, I think that would be a really, really great way of talking about what we should do with this building. Let's just sweep it. And in that sweeping, we'll find a strategy. And maybe what we'll do is we'll take that building apart. And what we'll do is we won't get new materials. We'll just reuse everything that's on the site and make a new building. And we'll just sweep the bits together. But obviously the Housing Association thought this was not, weren't interested. But that idea of like how to work in the process of bidding, how to convince the commissioner or the client or whoever to slow it down, to think more kind of dialogically, to think more laterally, is always a challenge. And one of the things I've just done is set up my own company in order to work with greater urgency, because actually, you know, in the last 6 months, I've just been thinking a lot about what is the future of this work when it's community based, and obviously we can't gather in places in the same ways. And I think relying on the older systems that are connected to these bigger agendas of regeneration and things like that, I'm really happy to walk away from the majority of most of those things now, and to think about how we can author things directly with communities. How can we model alternative economic, small scale, local work in order to shift the way that a city can function? So a city like Swansea, 300,000 people, we've got four or five projects in the city centre. We're looking at the possibilities of radically shifting the agenda of how people think about green urban space, and how people think about food plan. Yesterday we found out there is no food plan for the city. And, you know, this is a really interesting time to think about the ideas of how we resource how we connect to our food systems, and how we do all that. It's, you know, austerity and marginalisation. You know, the COVID crisis has shown us the cracks more than anything. So we're seeing the cracks in our local context and on global scales, whether it's austerity or economics or racial injustice. All these cracks are emerging from, which were there anyway, but are being heightened. So how do we work with that on a local scale through projects like this, or ways of working? So the project or the company is actually called Ways of Working, because what I find is I have to work in lots of different ways depending on who we're working with. And there's a sort of invitation in that to adapt to the way that you want to work and the way that the community want to work. So I guess that sort of brings us into that space of like, yeah, how do we author ways of working with communities which are kind of like bottom up or kind of grassroots, and again speak to this idea of a radical future.
Fee, I'll bring you in here because actually you could argue that the classroom is a microcosm of society, and you're seeing all of the cracks there, and you're seeing all of the diversity within, say, a group of 30 children. How do you avoid what we, again, in the architectural profession, we end up with this sort of this middle class realm of parents or parents who would encourage their children to do particular types of activities. Maybe you see this more at the design museum that you may do in the classroom, but how do you ensure that society is represented within your work?
We put a huge amount of emphasis on who it is that we're working with, and I think you have to, in terms of planning a project, sometimes we spend the same amount of time as Tom was saying, and kind of getting to know the context you're working in and doing that recruitment stage of who these young people will be. As that period can take as long as the going into the kind of briefing and design stage. We've learned through failure, don't try and create your own community. Don't jump in and assume that that people will come flocking to you. You've got to find who are the key community characters who are already doing that, who are trusted by the people you're wanting to reach. So if you're wanting to reach young people who are more at the edges, maybe who've been excluded from school, who have special educational needs, who perhaps feel particularly disempowered and disenfranchised, then go to the people that they trust. And work with them, have a dialogue with them. And I think the other side is recognizing that obviously as designers, and I have a design background, even though I work predominantly now in education, but we can become fixated on the product and the building, the space. And actually the value in the projects is much more in terms of the process, whether that's just the day-to-day conversations that people have, or confidence that they get from it, or networks that they build, as well as kind of specific maybe educational outcomes. But for us, we kind of see success in those terms. And I think to begin with, we were quite timid about if the project funder had a group in mind that might be kind of, there's nothing, all children deserve these projects, so it's not to say that middle class children don't, but I think what COVID and austerity is showing is that there is a real need for these projects at the edges with young people who are less advantaged, and therefore we have a responsibility to take our privilege and say we would like to work with this type of young person, and to find them. And I sometimes think with starting a project, and maybe this says too many bad things about my driving, but I can see that Dove, who's one of our freelance project managers, is on the call, and she might agree with this, with my driving style. Occasionally I'll have to say to myself, find the gear, find any gear. And it's sometimes starting a project can be the same way of testing the water with, it might be that the group you're working with, they're not ready for a really ambitious project, and maybe they don't need a really ambitious project. So it's putting quite a lot of different options on the table, and even if it's just the tiniest, even if it's just starting with a cup of tea and a conversation, and that's all that someone's willing to commit to, start with that, because you have no idea where that will go, and that's much better than necessarily going in with a grand plan that sends everyone running to the hills in fear.
It's funny though, isn't it? Because it does feel like you're almost shining a mirror on yourself, and these situations are almost exposing you to having to put your desires aside to actually then focus on the needs of this community. And I love the way you describe the value in the process as being the measure of success. Tom, you're dealing with something that is very personal to you, just by the very nature of how the research and the intellectual endeavour is delivered. Where do you find the value in the process? Is it, or the success maybe of the scheme? Is it within that process-driven research, or is it in the outcome? So, for example, with the Hedge School, you're planning something quite deliberate for next year.
Yeah,
it's a kind of almost a piece of theatre, you could argue.
It could be. I think that it's working out, for me, working out how these kind of almost public-facing moments fit within the longer process, and also allowing the process to not be determined by the public-facing moment. So leaving it open enough, which I guess is a freedom that one has within a PhD that maybe is more difficult if working with a funder or a client directly, is that you can leave the outcome. The outcome can be led by what happens in the process, much more in a much more free-form way. As for, I mean, the Hedge School, the way I'm envisioning it at the moment, although that's obviously given the world, COVID, everything that's been discussed already, it's having to I can't actually even say exactly how it's going to be delivered at the moment.
That's all right. I mean, because you don't know, or because you want to keep it sort of in your mind until things unravel themselves? Because if you don't have a linear path, which is what you're describing, you're bouncing around a little bit, and that's exactly how fee is.
I think again, it's a bit of both. I mean, the way originally I envisioned it to be kind of a series of events going on in and around Derry initially on the 3rd of May next year, and that could be everything from a walk across the border with one person to a collection of a translator, someone from the police, a geologist, different kinds of expertise that actually come together and make kind of co-author a piece of work that responds to elements of borderness or begins to try and dismantle borderness in some way in response to kind of things that are going on around us at that moment in time. I mean, I don't know that can happen, and I don't know how that might be able to work on Zoom. Maybe, I mean, how can you lurk and embed yourself digitally? And I don't think I have the answer to that yet at all.
And probably won't either. Owen, if we look at your portfolio of work, sometimes when I'm looking at your projects, there's a kind of looseness. It could be misunderstood as chaos, and you may say that actually you're looking very graceful on the surface and pedaling very hard underneath. But there is a looseness because maybe artistically you're trying to find an in the way that Fee describes that actually not every project starts at the beginning. It has to start somewhere that's comfortable for the audience you're facing. How do you can you expand on that?
Yeah, and thanks for that bit of feedback. Looseness is obviously intentional, but obviously what I'm trying to get at there is the idea of when you come to a project, you're often not coming through the right door. So, like, how do we kind of start again? How do you kind of reset the project a little bit in that first meeting? And thinking about utility or use. You know, that's one of the big serve, or how will this be of use to this place and this community. So I guess the looseness in it is intentional, in the sense that what we're trying to say is that we're welcoming, or we're interested in a range of explorations of space, or of whatever the a phrase that she's coined and said to us yesterday is, what does a landscape for human flourishing look like? And the idea of, like, how do we actually, you know, and that looseness seems integral to a question like that flourishing, or that kind of working with the culture of a place.
It's all fascinating stuff, and I think it just dawns on me in this conversation as well, from all of the kind of the buzzwords that I've been writing down while you've been talking, that there's a major failure in this conversation. The failure is obviously context. Failure is the fact that here we are, even though we have got a kind of Eurovision representation of Wales, Ireland and England, actually, we don't have anybody from Galway. We don't actually have a sense of that embedded nature. You're the closest by a long shot, Tom, but you're not there. So I suppose I'd like to maybe just touch on pitfalls and failures and the kind of do's and don'ts that Galway needs to learn if it's going to be running some form of summer school next year. Tom, could you maybe sort of make a couple of suggestions as to what we need to look out for and what we need to actually start with?
Maybe, do we need a summer school?
Oh, the academic in you.
Well, no. I mean, I guess it's, I don't know Galway, and I don't know where in Galway this might take place, but kind of really thinking about kind of a site or a constellation of sites, and then using that to respond to what might be the best outcome. And it could well be a summer school. Often I found one can end up going back after kind of a rigmarole back to where your initial hunch might have been, and just be slow and generous.
Slow and generous. Fee, could you add to that?
I think who this is going to engage, who is it for, and what genuinely are their needs. Or I once had a boss who always said, what's their pain? What's someone's pain? Everyone's got a pain, and if you find out what it is, then you'll find that they want to do it and they see the value in what you're offering. But definitely time, and both time before but also time afterwards. What's the legacy of this going to be? Are you going to leave? Are you going to stay? What will stay there? And maybe on a very practical point with that, how is it going to be funded? And sometimes the most interesting projects are the ones that can have the tiniest seed funding at the start, and that the momentum will gradually grow, and that will bring the funding to the project.
I suppose that's been evident from what people have been saying as well, that actually 2021 might just be a starting point, and it might be, as you say, we don't have to always dive in the deep end. We can jump in the side or wherever. We need to feel our way into this, partly by maybe being embedded. Owen, any other further thoughts on that? Because you're quite a critic when it comes to these types of things.
I guess it's resonance. Like, what's the resonance of this, and what are the outcomes going to be? And how will you work with everybody who wants to work with you? How will you work with everybody in Galway who says they're Galwayan and they want to work in this work? They want to be engaged in this work. And also, just one of the things that Niall, you and I've talked about a lot in Wales is this connection to material, to the landscape. What are the materials and the landscapes, and what's there already? What's there that we can be using and learn from that landscape? So what are the traditions, and what are the things that are the rhythms of a place, and how can we feed into that? But other than that, I think Fiona and Tom said it brilliantly. Avoid pop-up banners. I'm a big hater of the pop-up banners. So don't do any pop-up banners. Otherwise, it sounds really interesting and really a generous place to be working, and I'm really, really interested to know more about it.
I suppose what I'd asked you as well as a group, this is meant to be a series of conversations, and the interest here is, as the introductory conversation, is to sort of feel our way to understand where we need to map this and who we need to talk to next. Could each of you maybe offer a recommendation for who you think we should be talking to? Fee, would you have anybody in mind that you would think would be a worthy contender?
On a non-specific name, I would say you need to be talking to the community. And obviously, as the person kind of specifically representing children, I would say there will be many, many enthusiastic teachers and youth workers who are doing incredible things already, but when combined with a larger team, could do really extraordinary things. And then specific people, who probably won't forgive me for saying this, but David Roberts might be familiar to you already from the Bartlett, but has a very interesting approach to community engagement and ethics. And definitely he always keeps Matt and I on our toes when it comes to how we go about our projects, from everything from the funding through to how we deliver them.
Okay, thanks for that. Tom, can you contribute, and don't say nobody? Or...
No, I can. I think if something very far away from Galway, I would say somewhere like the Centre for Land Use Interpretation in Los Angeles, and the way they work in creative and critical responses to land and human interaction with it. There's also an artist who works mainly in specifically in outer London, called Verity Jane Keefe, who I think has a very long-term relationship with Barking and Dagenham, and is a really fascinating example of what happens when you stay
local. Exactly. Owen, can you add one further name to the list before we close out?
Yeah, I mean, having just talked to Caroline Steele yesterday and being totally blown away by her and her new book, Citopia, I think Caroline brings a reading to food systems as a lens of how to understand historically and contemporary issues around urban design and communities. But also, I was just thinking, I mean, she would be fantastic, but I was just thinking about a bus driver, a school teacher, a farmer, and a fisherman, a fisher person, I don't know, some people who are involved in the everyday infrastructure of a city who kind of see it in a different way would be real of interest. Yeah.
I think the last comment's very important, isn't it? Otherwise, we're just falling into the classic trap of just working in a silo and just think that we have the answers, effectively helicoptering in without having the helicopter. But look, it's been really great to talk. We've run out of time already. Can you believe it? An hour goes very quickly. Owen, thanks. Good to see you looking scholarly with your bookshelves. Fee, with your Stanley Kubrick backdrop. And Tom, well done for getting to Cork and surviving the ferry trip. It's been my pleasure, Niall Maxwell for Royal Office for Architecture, for hosting this, the first of a number of conversations as part of the Architecture at the Edge Festival. Thanks to Frank and Rosie. That's us finished for tonight.